Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Ian.
Hello.
Is that...
Aha.
Hello?
Hello. How comes I can't see you? Camera's not. I'm not on.
You've disappeared from my screen too, actually.
I should have come back now. Hang on.
Yes.
Ah!
There you go. Ah, hello, Lynn.
Hello, Andrew.
Can't see you, but we can hear you. That's good. Nice. I'm glad you're back. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I couldn't get this to work. Just a minute. Oh. You can hear me, but you can't see me.
Yeah.
Hello.
Oh, still can't see you, Lynn.
No, I don't. Well, according to the settings here, the video.
Oh, and there's the other Lynn. Hello, Lynn.
Right.
If the video doesn't seem to be working, the best thing to do, Lynn in Ireland, is to probably just ring off and then dial back in again and see if it comes this time.
Okay, will do.
Hello.
Hello, Joanna. There we go. Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear. That's nice. How are you?
I'm okay. I've got a man here fixing the immersion heater, so I may dash off to sort that out. There's been no hot water for a week, so.
Oh dear, goodness. Yeah, no, that's. Well, I'm glad you've managed to get somebody. And I saw Nick briefly.
Yes, I'm here. You were talking to Linda at the time, and then I popped off, but I am here now. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Right. Hello, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hello then. No, it's still in the dark. Can you see?
It's working.
It says it's working. Okay, but can you see me? Okay.
Yeah, I can see you fine.
You can see. Oh, that's okay. Well, we'll just have to make do, I suppose. Whenever you want to speak, just put on your microphone and speak up. And although we won't see you, we'll still see you. The screen will go blank, and we'll know that it's you. So.
Okay, I'm really feeling very blank today.
So that's fine. But I'm glad you're here. And remember, anyone who's not speaking, just to turn your microphone off at the time so that the bandwidth is not overloaded. That's grand. And we're waiting for a couple of other people. I think Liz should be with us today. Eventually. Oh, well then, what's that? Probably my computer. I've just been signed up as an organizer of the I organisation, which is Academics for Yes, which was launched at the weekend. So I've got to help organise the web page and the Facebook page and such like things. So I've been doing a little bit of that, some para-diplomacy almost today. Well, today we're going to have a look at these papers that I suggested you look at, which was looking at governance in islands and the sort of successful use of island powers, or successful use of islands, of powers at least, to get what they want. So we're going to have a look at that. But in the meantime, I'm hoping that quite soon Adam from Greenland will be able to join us. He's going to talk a bit about how Greenland has been trying to maximise its wealth by carrying out various mineral grabs from companies and countries that have been coming in to try and make use of the resources now that some of the ice is retreating a bit in Greenland. Now, Adam has been involved in island studies for quite a while now. He did his PhD in folklore in Aberdeen, but he has gone off on an interesting tangent and been studying islands, and has been involved in organising a lot of conferences worldwide, actually, for an organisation which he set up, which is called Island Dynamics. And there's a, I've forgotten the name of that, that's an island off the coast of Shetland. Dorness or something like that. Anyway, but so he's been to Iceland. He's been to Shetland several times as well, and organised conferences in Shetland. And he is a very sort of proactive and interesting person who has done a lot to promote the idea of island studies, and managed to organise conferences in quite some out of the way places. So he's organised one in Unst, and there's another one coming up in Unst next month. And at the beginning of next year, he'll be organising a very interesting conference in Svalbard, in Longyearbyen, right up in the very, very far north of the world, which will be looking at IT practice and interesting ways that communities have been using IT to overcome distance and to be able to tap into all sorts of aspects of modern life that otherwise they would have been left out of. So that should be a very interesting conference. I'm hoping to put forward a paper for that. And I've also got to do something for him in Unst next month, which will be looking at folklore in Shetland, because the people are coming over for a folklore conference, but from all different parts. So Adam's just got his first academic job over in Greenland. So he's hoping that he'll be able to dial in. He isn't able to use Jabber. It seems as if some of the technology in Greenland takes a little bit of time for people to become acquainted with and to upload onto the computers and things. So what we're going to try and do is use Skype. Now Skype, as you may know, doesn't actually connect to the video conference. So he's going to have to connect to the screen, my computer screen, but then I can show the computer screen using the VC. So you'll be able to see him speak if he's able to connect. But,
can I ask you a question, please?
Certainly.
This thing in Unst next month, when is it? And can anybody go?
Well, I'm sure anyone can go. You have to become a delegate. Let's have that. Let's have a quick look. I'll go for my. Let's see. Let's have a look. Calendar. That's not the right one. Just be with you in a second. Oh, come on. What's it doing? Want to sign me in with the wrong. Okay, hang on. That's weird. Okay. I'll have to get back to you on that because I can't get onto my Google account which has got my calendar on it. So that's very strange.
Folk Belief and Traditions of the Supernatural, 25th to 30th of March.
That's the one.
Supernatural in Literature and Film, 29th to 31st.
Yes, he's doing two
overlapping, yeah.
Ah, that's good. Folk Belief and Traditions and Supernatural, that's it, yeah. There we go, that one there. call for papers is closed, but I think there still could be an opportunity to attend if you're interested. It'll be a matter of registering online. But if Adam's with us in a short while, you can ask him yourselves. So, I'll be talking about magical thinking in the folklore of Shetland. A bit different.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm interested in, because coming from a health perspective, there's a lot of mythology and old culture for healthcare practices and beliefs. That would
Absolutely.
be interesting.
Yeah. I'm sure that'll be covered to a certain extent in the conference. Indeed, folk belief about how different plants can be useful, and how also seeing the right charms and visiting the right sacred wells and things are also supposed to be efficacious. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting conference. So I'll make sure you have a chat to him either today, or you get his email and you can contact him about the conference.
That'd be excellent, because I wouldn't mind talking to him about Iceland as well.
Righto, okay. Okay, well, we'll just, I think he was going to try and be here by about 15:15. That was the time it would take him to get from one room to the other and turn on the Skype system. So we've still got a little bit of time here before he joins us. And I just wondered if anyone had come across this paper in this article in today's Mail. Not I read the Mail, but I did catch this. Seemed relevant. It's Simon Heffer visiting the Falkland Islands and giving a report about the incredible oil reserves that are there to be tapped soon, and how the islanders are going to become extremely wealthy very soon too. I don't think Simon Heffer advocated this for Scotland, I have to say. But anyway, he's advocating for Falklands, that they're going to be extremely wealthy from their oil funds. So it's available online, so have a little look at that if you like. Has anyone seen it?
Yeah, I saw it this morning. It's it's a Daily Mail article, and I filter it accordingly. But the points are good points, and continue on from perspectives that have been given over the last 6 months to a year about the oil growth, and how determined they are not to let anything interfere with it. One of the interesting conversations that's going on is that when we get our oil income coming in, shall we start paying for enhanced defence, more defence than we've got now? That's one of the conversations that's going on in the Falkland Islands. So whether they're suggesting that the British Army takes on a mercenary style and more people are stationed there, or whether they're saying we'll pay for defence, the defence expenditure in the expectation it will be enhanced, I don't know. But there's a conversation starting, which is rather interesting.
It is an interesting one, because it also shows that they realise that things could be, well, unpopular back in Britain if we were told that we were spending an enormous amount of money to protect them, and they were having a big windfall of wealth at the same time. So I think it's very interesting that they've decided to broach that particular question, at the beginning, as it were. So it shows that they're sympathetic and aware of how things might look.
The idea of paying for defence is not new. I think Iceland has largely done that over the past with, until quite recently, a substantial American Air Force presence at Keflavik, and the promise that an American Army division would come if necessary, thus relieving Iceland of the need to have anything other than a small sea defence force for fishery protection. And I think, probably, but don't know, that the Icelandic government may have paid something towards that.
It's a good question. I'm not sure if they did, because there was always slightly controversial in Iceland to have a large American base at Keflavik. There was quite a strong opposition to it, or shall we say it was a split 50-50, those who were happy to see it and those who thought it was a bit of cultural imperialism. And in the 60s and 70s, when we lived there, they actually made it difficult to access American. If you had the right technology, you could access all these American channels on the TV, but basically it was difficult to get that. So there were all these channels that looked, well, when I was a boy, it looked exciting, you know, like as if there was lots of cartoons and everything on it, but you couldn't actually get them because they were being blocked. So there was definitely antipathy amongst certain parts of the Icelandic population towards having Keflavik there. So I don't know if they paid towards it or not. Well, maybe there's a quid pro quo. We will allow you to have your military base here if in return you protect us. I think rather than Iceland paying for it as such. But I mean, I could be wrong, but that was never my impression.
Yes, I should think that might be right. That it suited the Americans because, well, NATO because of the Denmark, the Iceland gap. Mm-hmm. And of course, it was difficult too, having been there. The prices inside the wire for anything you might want to buy were a fraction of the prices outside the wire, which took, I think, also a lot of managing. We largely ran our Iceland expedition based on things we bought inside the wire, I have to say.
Yeah. And of course, Keflavik is no longer. So, well, the Keflavik's still there, but the base isn't really there anymore because that was one of these peace dividends things the Americans more or less withdrew. So, and that caused a problem in Iceland as well because they hadn't realised what a big contributor it was to their economy at the time. So, but they seem to have weathered that one. Right. Well, let's see if we can get Adam. We might just have to keep trying and hope. Hello, Adam.
I'm just trying to arrange the camera.
That's fine. Yeah, take your time. It's good just to be able to see the room there.
How's the light in here?
Yeah, it's fine. Very bright. That's nice though.
Oh, that's nice. Oh, it's not so bad like this, I suppose. Might look like I'm looking off the other direction. But so when does the actual class start?
Now.
No.
Yeah, I'll just introduce you to everybody.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't say anything embarrassing yet.
No, all's well. We're doing a sort of interesting combination here. We've tried this before in the past and it worked, which is using Skype and the VC equipment. Perhaps we could maybe move the camera just a little bit so you're a little bit bigger in it, because what we're going to have to do is we're going to be putting you on the VC screen here, and then we're going to be, everyone will be able to see it from their screens at home in various places.
Either I move or the camera moves. So.
Whatever you like.
I'll move a little bit closer myself. I was going for the small person, large country approach myself.
We like the big faces. We like big faces on these screens. That's super. Well, as you just get yourself comfortable, what I'll do is I'll move my camera around, and if everyone can, in turn, just say a hi to Adam. It probably won't be. This won't be terribly good quality video, Adam, because as I say, we're using both different technologies here, and a little bit of manual endeavour. But now then, okay. So, well, if Ian
Hi,
on the
Adam.
screen, if you'd like to say hi. Oh, there's Nick. Hi, Nick.
Hi Adam, thanks for coming to see us today. My name's Nick. I'm in Chappensea in Orkney.
The
Hi,
sound
Ian.
is a bit tricky, actually.
That's okay. Well, that's Nick, and he's in Chappensea in Orkney.
Oh,
Hi, and this is Ian, and I'm near Kyle of Lacalsh in the northwest of Scotland.
That's Ian, near Califacalsh.
Hi, this is Liz in Inverness.
in Inverness. Yep.
Yeah, hi.
There we go. Liz, camera's not terribly clear, but yeah, she's in Inverness. Yeah.
It's Lynn in Ireland.
Oh, sorry.
Lynn's having trouble with her camera as well. She's in Ireland. Because she's from Tasmania.
Oh, Tasmania.
Yeah.
And this is Joanna in Stromness in Orkney.
There you go. That came through okay. Yeah, that's Joanna. She's in Stromness. So we've got a couple of people in Orkney. Who else? Oh, yes, and we've got Lynn. Where's Lynn? Lynn the Lime.
Yeah, I'm Lynn, and I'm way down in Wales, away from Scotland. Hiya.
So Lynn's in Wales.
Oh, great.
So we've got quite a wide area here. We've got a couple in Orkney, myself in Shetland, somebody in Inverness, somebody in Kyle of Lacalsh, and somebody in Wales, and yourself in Greenland.
Greenland, that's right. Yeah. I just came here about 3 weeks ago, so I'm not a true expert yet, but hopefully I could have some things of interest to contribute to your class.
Well, I'm sure you will. I was just I was introducing you while we were waiting to see if you were going to be able to come, and I was talking about island dynamics and the conferences that you organise, and the one that you'll be in Shetland next month. So there's a bit of interest expressed in that, but I presume, we'll talk about that later on, but people are interested in your career and the things that you're up to. I was also mentioning the conference in Svalbard at the beginning of next year. Now that's a very intriguing and interesting conference. The topic is fascinating about using what we're doing at the moment, I suppose, to shrink the distance. And also it's a fascinating place in its own right. And I was also saying that this was your first academic position and it was an interesting place to have it in Greenland. So you're the person to tell us a bit about Greenland today and whatever you would like to tell us about Greenland today. What we have been discussing in general is island governance in this class. It's about how different islands, just like the conference that you held most recently, how islands can maximise their influence and power over their own affairs in the different ways that they do that. And I believe you've got some interesting things to tell us about how Greenland does that.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be glad to. That's actually the topic of my class here in Greenland as well. I'll give a sort of brief presentation as to what's actually going on in the community here, and then I suppose a sort of discussion is a bit tricky, obviously, using our cobbled together technological solution here. But we'll try to open some things up to questions, and some kind of discussion as well. So, just as a sort of I assume most of you have some kind of background involving Scottish small islands, obviously, which is sort of a good point of comparison as far as this is concerned. Because in some sense, we could say that Greenland is a kind of archetypal small island. It only has 57,000 people. So it's a pretty small, larger than many of the Scottish communities that we might be speaking about. But it's a kind of the sort of typical size, a sort of sweet spot for these sorts of subnational island jurisdictions, which have exceptional powers, which Greenland does. That's what we're talking about here. So Greenland's kind of in the Isle of Man level as far as population is concerned, quite similar to Guernsey and Jersey and so on. About 3 Shetlands, I guess, if you look at it that way. But in terms of land area, obviously, Greenland's not a small place at all. In fact, Greenland is, I've written it down because otherwise I'd have no chance with this. Greenland is 2,166,086 square kilometers. That's about 1,500 Shetlands, including Faroe Island. Something to recall with Greenland here, I have this suspicion that you all have a general idea of what shape Greenland's in. It's kind of in sort of corner of the map. Greenland looks like, from a distance, from the only distance that most of us ever see it, Greenland looks like one big island. But there's a lot of icy stuff in the center, actually. Most of Greenland isn't really livable in the sense that we'd call living. So actually, Greenland has a lot of small communities which are arranged around its coasts, primarily on the west coast, in fact. The largest of these is the town that I'm in now, called Nuuk, and has 17,000 people. So this is, again, out of a population of 57,000. But otherwise, these other settlements, towns and settlements on the island, are ranged around the coasts. What's quite interesting here is that there's a big drop-off after Nuuk. Then we have Sissimut, which is about 5,600 people. Then Ilusiat, which is 4,500. And then we get into the 3,000 zone. So there's a big difference between the large communities at the top and then the smaller towns as we go. But a large percentage of the population does not even live in these small towns, but lives in what are here called bygder, which is a nice Scandinavian word, obviously. But these are small settlements. What makes the Greenland situation rather interesting here is that despite its big, kind of monolithic shape, it in many ways resembles sort of South Pacific archipelagos, in the sense that many of these smaller communities, both the towns and the settlements, are located on small islands which are off the coast of mainland Greenland. And there's no transportation by road. There are roads here in Nuuk and in the other towns, but they stick within the towns. None of the towns are connected to one another by road. From Nuuk, you can't drive anywhere except other places in Nuuk, which are exciting, but there are limits. Otherwise, people are pretty much dependent on boat or plane or helicopter for travel. Obviously, depending on where you are in Greenland, boat can be a bit tricky this time of year. Right now, there are no boats coming in and out of Nuuk because there's quite a lot of ice in the water. So it's really plane travel that we're dealing with in this sense. And actually, this presents one of the big challenges for Greenland, sort of belied by its size. And I think one of the big challenges here is psychological, in the sense that Greenland does look like this large spot on the map. So a lot of people from outside might not realize the actual dynamics of what it's like living here and moving here, moving around within the island. People who I've spoken with in my time here, who come from other towns and other settlements on the island, it's actually cost less money and might not really take any more time to fly from Nuuk to Copenhagen than to fly from, or then to get from Nuuk to one of the other towns here. So they have what in the island studies literature is really referred to as multiple peripherality. Greenland itself is peripheral to Denmark, which in some ways is sort of its colonial power, as we'll be speaking about in a bit. But then at the same time, there are the peripheral areas to the capital city, to the capital town of Nuuk. And this has a big influence on the way life works here. In some ways, you might expect Nuuk to sort of function the way that Lerwick does in Shetland, or Kirkwall in Orkney, in terms of being the center where things happen, where people go shopping from elsewhere in the island. But because of the great distances involved and the lack of land transport and the expense of the other transport that's going on, in fact, Nuuk pretty much serves itself. I suppose people from other towns might come here occasionally for sorts of big purchases, for the sort of shopping to which the internet economy hasn't really reached in Greenland yet. But generally speaking, these smaller towns or working on their own in terms of the way the economies there work. The feeling that I've gotten while I've been here is that there is a tendency, of course, for Nuuk to grow, which is the case in many of these small island capitals that we could be talking about. But it's not really that simple. Nuuk has only grown by about 3,000 people in the past 15 years, which actually isn't all that much when you consider all the modernization that's been happening. There is a lot of new development, a lot of new buildings here, but that's mainly because of old buildings being knocked down. It's sort of important, I think, to understand the Greenlandic identity, to understand that in Nuuk, which in many ways we might expect to be sort of the cultural center of Greenland, traditionally large numbers of the population, a large percentage of the town's population, were housed in really industrial, almost sort of Soviet-style apartment blocks. There's one building which was knocked down a few years ago to be replaced by many smaller buildings, which apparently at one point housed about 1% of Greenland's population. And there's still a number of these other buildings left where we have a few thousand people living in just a row of blocks of flats. So it's quite intriguing in that sense. But what tends to be happening is that people from the settlements, from the Bukta, are moving into the towns, and people from the towns are moving into Nuuk. Of course, no one's actually moving into the settlements, which causes some problem for that sort of traditional lifestyle. And the reason that we could speak of a traditional lifestyle in the settlements is that these are still the places where what we could think of as traditional Greenlandic activities are still practiced. I ate some lovely, or at least interesting, raw whale skin the other day. It's called matak or something, rather like that. Dipped in MSG, which is quite intriguing, but that's a local habit. I believe that it was a humpback whale, or the people who served it to me believe that was a humpback whale. This kind of fangst culture, the sort of hunting culture of hunting seal, which I believe is disgusting, but that's just me. Seal and whale and seabirds and so on is still very prevalent out in the far rural communities, out in the settlements, especially in the north of Greenland, which is where this industry is really located. In the far south of Greenland, you have an economy which might in many ways resemble more like that one has in the islands of Scotland, in which there's a lot of sheep farming. I suppose that sort of informal subsistence economy based on agriculture, whereas in the north you're going to have the informal subsistence economy based on having to eat whale and seal every day. It all depends on what you like, I suppose. But most Greenlanders who I speak to they locate the traditional culture of Greenland in these faraway places, which are losing population and have very much aging populations, because young people, of course, who are having different kinds of educations and different kinds of aims for their lives, don't particularly want to live in these places with bad internet connection and low levels of services. So there's, of course, also a leakage of human resources, if we're going to speak in this technical sense, to Denmark, because Greenland is traditionally a part of Denmark, and it still is today. We'll go into some more details about that in a moment. But Greenlanders have the right to have an education at Danish universities, as well as have all the benefits of being educated in Danish universities, which means getting money for being educated. It's one of the lovely things about Denmark. You're actually paid to go to school. It actually really is lovely. I actually studied English briefly in Denmark for precisely this purpose. But that aside, it does mean that there's even more of a loss of skills, loss of talents than we'd often have in these sorts of communities, because there's a very easy structure for people to be educated elsewhere. Now, some of you in the audience out there, on your various screens, might be thinking to yourselves that this, of course, is quite similar to what happens in the Scottish and the British Islands in general, and that is true. But the difference here is that Greenland actually has a far greater level of autonomy, as you've probably been speaking about a bit among yourselves in my absence as well. So Greenland maybe has more need for certain of these skills. And also, when we talk about the distance, with Greenland making a place like Shetland seem positively metropolitan in terms of its connection to large towns and cities and so on, it means that Greenland is really having to serve itself in terms of its workforce and many parts of its economy. It's impossible to commute, let's put it that way. And here, it's not just impossible to commute to and from Denmark, it's also impossible to really commute between towns, which makes a big difference. It lowers their threshold. Let's say it lowers their threshold for, actually, I guess it raises the threshold. Depends on which side of the threshold you're on. It raises the threshold for the amount of human resources that we're really able to lose in terms of the way government and governance works here. But a bit more of history, I think, could be useful. You know, the Vikings, of course, did get to Greenland, and they did some stuff. I'm sure that Andrew knows far more about this than I do, because I know nothing about what the Vikings did in Greenland, except there's still some housey things, which are less, some remains, and then some saga descriptions and so on. But, you know, that connection was lost, and I'm sure there's another point, which Andrew could tell you more about later. The Danes got interested in Greenland again, because, of course, Norway eventually became part of Denmark and so on. Although the Norwegians might say that Denmark became part of Norway. Well, depends on your national perspective. The Danes regained interest in Greenland later on at the time of the idea of the lost Danish settlements and in terms of Christianization ideas. He thought that there were all these poor Greenlandic people who didn't have the word of the Lord. But really, our history of modern Greenland, we could say, starts in the early 20th century, when there's more and more Danish economic activity happening here, more and more Danes coming to Greenland in colonial towns. Greenland was truly a colony then. It was considered a colony. Denmark actually had quite a bit of a history of colonization, even though we don't think of it this way anymore. But Greenland first became part of, we could say, Denmark proper in 1953, actually, when Greenland became part of what's called the Rigsfællesskab, became part of the actual Kingdom of Denmark in 1953. Prior to that, it simply had colonial status. The Kingdom of Denmark difference mattered in the sense that Denmark had different responsibilities toward Greenland, and people in Greenland started thinking, people in Denmark started thinking differently about what those responsibilities were. Now that Greenland truly shared the same queen, it made a bit of difference. King as well, of course, back then. A big change happened.
Just a wee second. Yeah, Lynn, could you just turn off your microphone, please? Excellent. Thank you very much. Sorry, Adam. Yeah, sorry.
Well, you know, Greenland got a different status in 1979. It got what we could call home rule status, which Greenlanders themselves, or at least the bureaucracy in Greenland, was somewhat freed from the political situations going on in Denmark. Greenland was able, got more self-control, got more autonomy. Greenland also, Greenland is not part of the EU, which is quite interesting from this perspective. Could kind of remind us of the UK's crown dependencies. Although if they're the UK's crown dependencies, again, is up to debate. Greenland would not really consider itself part of Denmark today, but the Danes might have a different feeling. And of course, when you look on the world map, Greenland's there with the word Denmark under it. But in 2009, so that means 30 years later, there was another big change. There was a referendum here, and 75% of the population of Greenland opted for self-rule, or selvstyre, as we'd say in Danish. I don't actually know what it's called in Greenlandic, but there you go. So Greenland moved in 2009 from home rule to self-rule, which meant that Greenland had even more powers. Greenland's autonomy system is very much related to what exists on the Faroe Islands, for example, in the sense that there's this concept of gradual increases in autonomy. Greenland has the right to take on more and more responsibilities as it becomes able to. So Greenland is sort of able to lead the way in consultation with Denmark in terms of its powers. Denmark still controls foreign policy, immigration as well, although I don't think Denmark's too heavy-handed about immigration, and various other legal issues. Obviously, these different issues are important in terms of what people are actually able to do. But we could say, from some kind of legal perspective, that there's not a massive difference between what Greenland's practical abilities are and legal abilities and those of, say, the UK's crown dependencies, in the sense that Greenland is responsible for its domestic policy. There's a big difference in terms of how these things are funded, however, because, I could go through this list of various economic activities in Greenland. We have sheep farming, as I say, and fishing, a big fishery here. A lot of the shrimp that one eats in Denmark, I know about in the UK, actually comes from Greenland, comes from a state-owned company or a Selvstyre-owned company here in Greenland. There's, of course, a big service sector. As we'll be talking about a bit more later, there are a lot of hopes for mineral and oil exploitation. The economy depends on what in Danish is called the bloktilskud. This is a grant, an annual grant from the Danish government, which you'll have to brace yourselves, is actually equivalent to 387 million pounds. So that's the equivalent of about 6,800 pounds per person. Comes from Denmark to Greenland every year. Per the self-rule agreement, however, this has been fixed. The sum has been fixed. What's being said is that it's not going to increase and doesn't increase with inflation either. So that, for example, just in the last year due to inflation in the Danish kroner, because Greenland uses Denmark's currency, in real terms, the bloktilskud per person decreased by about 200 pounds. So this does make a difference. One problem here, in this sense, is that the idea that once Greenland becomes independent, or if Greenland becomes independent, because there is a lot of debate about this, is that the bloktilskud will be stopped, of course, because then Greenland will no longer be Denmark's responsibility, is the concept. I think it's kind of problematic to be thinking about things in this way, however, for a few reasons. First, we'll get into a little bit about the Greenland's prospects in terms of how it might become economically self-dependent. Because when you think about the amount of money which is coming into Greenland per person, this is obviously a large sum to try to replace via, we could say, local economic activity. Greenland, by the way, not only has its Selvstyre, its central government, but also has a number of the equivalent of counties. I believe 5 of them, which have their own powers over local government. But the idea, the big hope, is that Greenland's economic future lies in its mineral wealth, in the sense that there's the idea that there are a lot of rubies in the ground here, some gold, uranium has been a big political issue. The Selvstyre government, the self-rule government, relatively recently decided to end the ban on uranium mining previously that had not been allowed. So the idea is now that it will be possible to mine for uranium before. And there's the idea also that there might be oil deposits off the coast of Greenland, although none of it has actually been found yet. Scientists believe it's there, but it hasn't actually been discovered. One governance sort of problem that Greenland has is, of course, it's a small place. It has limits to what it could do itself with this mineral exploitation and extraction activities. It's not able to run giant mining operations involving thousands of people, clearly, because there simply isn't enough money. And in this sense, Greenland isn't special. We find this with various island communities worldwide, which have mineral wealth, that you have to turn to outsiders to get it. So the idea has been for Greenland to kind of open up to the world more and try to get international business interest. A few years ago, there was a lot of talk about Chinese companies investing in Greenland and opening mines here. And then, of course, you have kind of Chinese worker enclaves, in the sense that you have Norwegian and American and British enclaves of mineral workers elsewhere in the world, living in their own separate communities and so on. A big concern locally, of course, is that's the sort of idea of handing over part of Greenland's autonomy, part of Greenland's ability to make decisions to foreign companies. And of course, some people are particularly worried about it being Chinese companies. But the issue is we could be talking about Indian, we could be talking about Norwegian or Danish companies. In a sense, it wouldn't make a difference. We're looking at the idea of Greenland potentially being able to make money from these economic activities in order to pay for independence from Denmark. Part of the difficulty that I find when thinking about the subject, and I suspect this will touch upon some issues that you've been talking about in class, is that Greenland has kind of gone into the habit, or the Greenlanders in general, of thinking about themselves as a sort of dependency culture. There's a constant talk about this bloktilskud, about the annual Danish grant. And of course, Danish politicians are happy to keep reminding Greenlanders of it, because it's one thing which Danes are able to feel good about themselves with. Look what we're doing for Greenland. We're giving them all this money. And yet they're so ungrateful, is how this sort of discourse goes. Yet the Greenlanders are so ungrateful that they no longer want to be part of Denmark. Unfortunately, I would say that Greenlanders in general have sort of bought into this kind of discourse of dependency. So that's become a kind of either-or scenario, in which the idea is that in order to truly gain emotional and cultural independence from Denmark, Greenland would have to gain actual political independence. And gaining political independence, because it means losing the grant from Denmark, would mean gaining economic independence. And one of the problematic issues here is that when we're talking about small places and small islands in particular, is that they have a lot less resources, political resources, at their disposal in order to try to get this kind of financial independence. Because let's face it, it's not as though Denmark isn't in debt. It's not as though Denmark doesn't sell its state debt to other countries. It's not as though Denmark is financially independent. But when you're a larger state, and in this case we could talk about Denmark as a big place, which is a nice little change for once. When you're a larger state, you have all these other policy options to play with. You have other ways of being able to look at what it means to be financially independent. The Danes don't view themselves as being dependent on other nations for charity, even though in this kind of globalized economy, globalized market, Denmark is. But when it's so easy, when we could draw the circle around what Greenland is, and look, there's ocean around it. We know where Greenland starts. We know where Greenland ends. It's not connected to any other place. It becomes that much easier to look at what money comes in, what money goes out. This is kind of an island issue in general. It becomes that much easier to say, well, look, they're not sustaining themselves. This money has to go in. And of course, there are many segments of the Greenland economy which aren't counted at all. If we think about sort of subsistence level activity, just as I would argue that the actual economic activity taking place in British rural communities, such as Orkney and Shetland and the Western Isles, is significantly underestimated because we have no way of dealing with people who slaughter their own sheep and eat them as food in the sort of barter economies and informal economies which exist. Anyway, the point here which I'm trying to get at is that there's something wrong with the way that people have gotten used to looking at Greenland's situation in the world. The Greenlandic people have generally speaking, although there's a big political difference between different parts of Greenland, Nuuk is much more cosmopolitan, much more Danish-oriented. There are a lot more Danes living in Nuuk itself. Virtually everyone here speaks Danish as well as Greenlandic, and most of them speak some English too. But generally speaking, there's this sense that Greenland needs to gain political independence in order to be able to feel proud of itself, in order to be their own people. What I would argue as a possibility for Greenland's future, of course I have no say in this, so it doesn't really matter, but it's fun to talk about, is that it would be possible to sort of discuss Greenland's situation using what Godfrey Badakino, who I'm aware you'll have a guest lecture by a bit later, in a few months' time maybe, by what he would refer to as the provision of strategic resources to Denmark. Denmark gains a lot of benefits from being involved in Greenland. The Danish military is based here, or was inside the Arctic Command the other day. Lots of pretty blinking screens. You know, Denmark does not actually get to benefit directly from Greenland's exclusive economic zone and fisheries zone, but because it's Denmark that controls the waters, Denmark gets an extra influence here in the far North Atlantic, because Denmark does not otherwise have any Arctic territories. Also, although Denmark gains no direct influence as a result of, or gains no direct benefit as a result of having the fishery zones. It does decrease, we could say, Iceland's fishery zone and Norway's fishery zone, because Norway owns Jan Mayen, has a little dot in the ocean, which increases Norway's capacity to do things in the Arctic. So Denmark gained some relative benefits and also the kind of military clout, which even for a small country like Denmark, the ability to have these military operations up in Greenland, I would argue, represents a strong strategic benefit. There's also a good sort of brand benefit for Denmark in the sense that Denmark is able to tell the world, look how much money we're giving to Greenland, look how we're good to our former colonies, compared with some other places which give their colonies some money and then try to let them down. Denmark has been asking the international community to contribute to Greenland's well-being. Denmark is able to say, we've been doing it ourselves. So I would say that Denmark is getting real, genuine benefits from its relationship with Greenland. It's not just a one-way equation where Denmark gives lots of money, the Greenlanders keep asking for more. And that this could be a starting off point for kind of changing the discourse about what it means to be one's own people and have pride. Because, to be honest, from this sort of island studies research perspective, we find that places which aren't outright independent but have a lot of powers on their own, places like Greenland tend to do better economically and often politically. And it doesn't necessarily need to stop places from feeling that they have their own independent culture. So for me, this would be a potential starting off point for seeing how Greenland could be independent within the Kingdom of Denmark and still be getting money. Because it seems kind of odd from my kind of, I guess, hard-hat economics perspective. I can't believe I just said that, seeing as I'm a trained folklorist and cultural researcher. But it seems kind of odd to be trying to say no to a gift of £6,800 per person every year, if you could get away with it. And I think that Greenland could potentially get away with it. But it takes a sort of mindset change. And it's difficult to enact these mindset changes because nothing's harder to change than culture. And I don't think that's a responsibility for governments to try to change their people's culture. But here it's difficult to say who's leading whom. The government is being led by perhaps still colonially oriented cultural thinking. So I think Greenland has a lot of challenges in the future, possibly potentials that it could exploit. One way or another, I think Greenland's probably going to be okay financially and culturally. But it'll be interesting to see how things work out, and especially from a within Greenland scenario, how Greenland deals with the population movement away from the settlements. A place like Shetland and to a very large extent other Scottish island jurisdictions. I guess that means two of them. That have their own jurisdictions are able to do this kind of preserving every settlement issue. But it's a difference when your island is a 10-minute ferry ride from the nearest island versus in Greenland when we're talking about hour-long about boat rides which last hours in order to get to an isolated, out-of-the-way settlement. There's a lot of talk which I've heard here about how one should close these places, how one should close down these towns because it's not sustainable having them all. And in a way, that's a tricky sort of argument because once you open up the possibility of closing settlements, then what's to protect the towns? One could even hear that sort of argument in the Scottish Islands, of course, which the folks on Unst in Shetland might say, well, why are we bothering to keep Papa Store and even Fettler open when this money could help make unsustainable? But then someone in Lerwick might say, well, Unst, that's a waste of money. And then, which means that someone in Scotland could then argue, well, Shetland, that's a waste of money. So it takes new ways of looking at things, I suppose. So that's all for me blathering on now. I'd be interested in having a little discussion with you, possibly ways that we could compare the Greenlandic situation with those in the UK.
Thanks, Adam. Those were a fascinating introduction to Greenland. Lots of interesting things to pick up, which I'll open the floor just in a second. I was just wondering, what since 2009, what responsibilities does Denmark have left, as it were, apart from sending lots of money every year to Greenland?
Well, I mean, there's the foreign policy responsibility, which we could say is in Denmark's sole possession. But then we could also say that there are many areas in which Denmark has partial responsibility. So, for example, I'm at a university in Greenland, the university in Greenland, but Denmark is also responsible for providing university education for the people who don't come here. You're going to have these sorts of areas of joint responsibility, which Greenland has said that it's not yet ready to take on its own. Denmark, and this is something which could remain the same even if Greenland became independent, Denmark is still the source of a lot of the skilled labor in Greenland. In the past, you had a lot of unskilled labor coming from Denmark to here as well, or unskilled relative to what's happening in Denmark, but not necessarily relative to what was in Greenland in the 50s, let's say. But these days, you still have a lot of company directors, even some people in government, civil servants, being Danish. Greenland is still dependent on Danish skills, let's say, if nothing else. And again, this is something which even independent states are dependent on other countries for these sorts of services, for skills and so on. You know, a population of 57,000 people is never going to be on its own.
No, absolutely. Could they not buy in the skills from somewhere else if they became independent, like Canada or the States or something like that?
Exactly. You know, before I came here, it was kind of my philosophy, having gotten tired of hearing Danes talk the way they do about Greenland in this sort of possessive manner, was my concept that that Greenland would be better off working with anyone but Denmark, and that Danes were deluding themselves in thinking that they had some possibility of getting involved in special issues with Greenland, when Greenland, you know, would probably even in some ways rather choose to deal with the United States or Canada or China in some senses than the old colonial power. Having been here and having realized just how much Danishness is part of the Greenlandic culture. By the way, I have encountered some unpleasant Greenlanders who, you know, here in Greenland I'm considered Danish, which is kind of funny. I've also encountered unpleasant Danes who are unpleasant about Greenlanders. So there's this cultural clash. In some ways, I think, given the situation now, Greenland might be best off trying to exploit its relationship with Denmark and get the most of this existing relationship that it can. But theoretically, yeah, these skills could come from anywhere, which is, you know, if one had a strong independent economy, it's the kind of thing that you could do. You could hire people from outside.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, okay. Well, I'll turn the camera around.
I might need your interpretation help.
I'll. If everyone asks questions slowly, in case they don't come over, and I'll relate it to Adam. Now, here we go. I could have gone a bit further. Closer. That's about as okay. Any questions or comments?
Yes. Can I ask about the Danish people in Greenland? Are they there because they've been sent from Denmark? Are they there because they've moved to Denmark? Or is it the sort of place that you go for 3 years before it's interesting, then you go home?
I heard everything except for the last part of the question. Everything after moved from Denmark I missed. If you could help out there.
Or is it the sort of place that people might go for 3 years because it's interesting and then go home again?
Well, it's sort of a combination. Before I came here, I'd had the impression that it might be a bit like Svalbard, where I've also lived, where you have people coming for short-term work. And in many ways, it does resemble that kind of situation, where people are coming and going all the time, in part because in Nuuk, where most of the Danes are coming to, there's a real housing shortage. Most people are having their housing provided by their employers here, which makes it quite difficult to move here unless you already have a job. I think people from Denmark are coming here for a combination of the adventure. You don't come to a place like this unless your burning desire to experience the kind of Arctic living, and also very good pay. It's this kind of combination of reasons. You do meet the long-term Danes who have been here for decades. I actually haven't met any people who would self-identify as Danes who were born here and who are now adults, which is intriguing. But what I have been asking people about in the sort of research that I've been doing on the side is to what extent the Danes here will feel that they've become local, has a distinct Danish culture developed within Greenland. Now, for someone like me who does sort of cultural studies, which I do, I'd say that inevitably places develop local cultures, whether or not people regard them as local cultures. But what I found very interesting is that no one who I've spoken with here, none of the Danes have said that a Danish local culture has developed. So you could be speaking with people who've lived here for 30-odd years who will say, this is my home. But they'll simply say that they're Danish, not that they're part of some Danish Greenlandic community.
Mm-hmm. When I was visited Greenland, I visited a couple of times, and it was usually the east coast, Tunu, the backside of Greenland, which is the isolated part of Greenland, I think. I'm sure we could have a chat about that just later on. But I did meet a couple of Danes there who still self-identified as Danes, but they also they felt that being in Greenland, and certainly in that area, they could go wild, I suppose. Go native in a sense. So they say they were going mental, driving around on snowmobiles and dog sledges and all that sort of stuff. So they hadn't become Inuit, but they were sort of being the Arctic explorers, sort of letting their hair hang down, living on the wild side.
Well, sorry. Oh, that's me echoing. My thinking about this, I've only been in Nuuk so far. I believe that there is a strong difference between what's going on here and what's going on in other parts of Greenland, simply in terms of here there's a large enough Danish community that you could really just hang out with Danes if you wanted to. In many other places, not everyone speaks Danish, which makes another big difference. I was speaking with someone the other day who's been in Greenland for 32 years and has not learned any Greenlandic. That would not be possible in smaller communities here. There's also the issue, I don't know really where you were in particular. I've noticed that we have to draw a distinction between Danes who are here in different capacities. The military people who I've met so far have been much more, you wouldn't call them Greenlandic or acting like Greenlanders, but a different philosophy about what Greenland means to them, and a much more wild experience in the Arctic philosophy than the others who I've met, regardless of if the military people live in Nuuk. So I think one gets different social divisions here, which are partially chosen by people themselves and partially which you just fall into because of what sort of work you're doing and where you're living.
Yeah. You're going to meet a whole lot of different people. Here we go. Here's Linda. Lynn, what would you like to ask?
Coming from a healthcare perspective, I was just wondering if Greenland imported the Danish health system or it's developed its own.
Okay, I'll ask. One of the things that we're looking at in governance is different policies that are developed. Well, we haven't gone to that yet, but we will do. But it seems a good opportunity to start. Lynn is doing a PhD on health provision in islands and sort of rural places, and she was wondering about the health care in Greenland. What's its nature?
Well, Greenland does have its own health authority and hospital and so on. I'm not so sure if you all are aware, Greenland's notoriously bad on many health issues. Like many other places in the world, of course, it has growing obesity problems. But it's kind of notorious for alcoholism and sexually transmitted diseases, which are sort of difficult issues to come to terms with. And maybe difficult issues to talk about in some senses. One's dealing with partially in terms of getting over these societal issues. One's dealing with kind of inherited problems which come about when you have a very rapid modernization process, which is what occurred here. But there are big movements in Greenland, of course, to increase healthcare. Something which has struck me, considering how in many ways it's a very Danish place, is that, in Denmark, a large percentage of the young people, will be out drinking in the bars on Friday and Saturday night. It's just what happens. It's part of the culture, you could say. And in many ways, maybe not all that different to what's happening in places in a lot of parts of Scotland. It could be problematic, depending on how you look at it. What I've realized in Greenland, here we have another social split. Because alcoholism is such a recognized problem, it's such a socially devastating problem here, I've met a very large number of people here who might have one beer every 3 months, but who wouldn't even think of going to a bar. Because there's a much stronger differentiation between those who lead bad lifestyles in terms of health and those who don't, because I think there's more public recognition in general about the dangers of these things. But obviously, healthcare governance. I've also been hearing there's an issue, of course, with healthcare provision for the very distant rural communities. Traditionally, many of the nurses tended to be Danish. Of course, you have these educated professionals. The Danes have to be brought in at vast expense, obviously, and the doctors as well. But they'll never be speaking Greenlandic, obviously. So even today, you still have, now there are many, many more Greenlandic nurses, for instance, but you'll still have interpreters going out with Danish nurses in certain situations. I suspect that you have very difficult healthcare problems when you're looking at the very small settlements scattered around the country.
Well, it must be very difficult with your extreme peripherality. If you've got, even in Nuuk, there must be certain procedures that can't be dealt with in
Sure.
And where do they go? Do they go flown over to Copenhagen or just left to die?
I suspect that healthcare is in some sense going to be some joint responsibility with Denmark here. Something which I was kind of surprised to hear is that when we compare with, say, a Shetland situation, the various towns around the country with their own hospitals, they take care of, for example, births. Not everything goes to Nuuk. So because of these vast distances and lengths of time involved, a lot more is decentralized than we might suspect when we consider the population here. Because here we're dealing with local authorities with these counties, which have very small populations in themselves. So it's a tricky situation. I guess in some ways we could draw some kind of Isles of Scilly comparison for some of these issues. But here Greenland's benefiting, of course, from having a rich colonial power. Greenland's gotten rather lucky in terms of what its colonial power was. I think obviously Denmark's not a big country in terms of money, but it's but Denmark is able to provide a level of service that I think, and I'm not actually, I'm very much, I'd say, against the traditional Danish colonial mindset here, and would be trying to educate people in terms of ways of making the most of what Denmark is begrudgingly offering. But Greenland's been rather lucky in that respect.
I was just wondering about folk medicine.
Lynn's very interested also in folk medicine, the sort of things that people do when they don't have access to modern healthcare.
Well, that's a kind of topic which fascinates me. I have to admit, though, I know nothing about it here.
Which brings me to another point. Are you going to be doing folklore and traditional custom research while you're there as well?
No. I'm focusing on governance processes, how government is carried out, and opinions that people have about how government is carried out, as well as the influence of IT actually on how Greenland relates to the world and how different parts of Greenland relate to each other. But none of the lovely, cuddly folklore research at the moment.
I'm sure you'll find some time for doing it if you, if you get the chance.
Can I
Okay.
ask
There's
a
always
follow-up
time for that.
question?
So yes, there you go.
I was just all that discussion makes me wonder what's in it for Denmark. I mean, why would they invest so much money? I mean, you've described a few things, but I wonder if you've got any clue. Is it because they feel responsible, or they're trying to build something for the future for the resource? What are they doing? Why are they spending so much money on Greenland?
Yeah, I think I basically got that, and it's a good excuse if I don't answer it very well. So, I mean, Denmark has no rights to anything that's in the ground in Greenland. Denmark is not able to take advantage of mineral wealth, and Greenland does not provide taxes to Denmark. It's not like an Åland situation. Besides these kind of issues involving, strategic services, I'm not so sure that Greenland really gives that much to Denmark, besides what I already spoke about, except that when we're dealing with these places, look, Denmark doesn't have a choice. And I think that this is part of something which maybe isn't discussed enough locally. And of course, it's difficult to discuss it in public, but, what's Denmark going to do? Even if Greenland became independent and the annual grant were cut off, if there were a massive economic crisis in Greenland, Denmark would have to step in. The international community would expect Denmark to step in. So Denmark's kind of been caught in this colonial net, in terms of international expectations as to what happens, and the Danes' own expectations about themselves, about being the best country in the world, and so on. I think Denmark really doesn't have much of a choice. And yes, I do think that Denmark gets rather important benefits, geopolitical benefits from Greenland. Whether or not geopolitics ought to work like that is something else. But given the way the world works today, I think there are rather good advantages which Denmark gets. But quite frankly, Denmark doesn't have a choice in this. I think that from the Greenlandic perspective, it comes down to finding ways of exploiting that necessity of Danish support. And in this sense, it's quite different than the crown dependency issues with the Isle of Man and so on.
Yeah. No, I mean, I know it gives Denmark a seat at the top table when Arctic
Sure.
issues are being discussed. But you also wonder, what does that really mean, other than having a seat at the top table when,
Yeah. And if Denmark didn't have Greenland, then Denmark would have no official Arctic interest whatsoever. And then there's always Svalbard, which one could go for. I think the fisheries issues are actually rather important, and in terms of being able to have an excuse to patrol the North Atlantic and the Arctic. No one's going to be attacking Denmark militarily these days. But it's just the way the world works that people like to have these things. Even today, the east of Greenland is under a sort of interesting jurisdictional issue because it was part of a Norwegian claim, and Denmark is kind of obliged to run patrols in parts of Greenland, military patrols, simply in terms of keeping hold of this. So Denmark obviously thinks that it has its own interest in this, but the Danes, as much as they might be patronizing about Greenlanders, which Danish people in general actually are quite patronizing about Greenlanders in Denmark. It's part of the national identity to not let the Greenlanders down. We can see even in a Faroese perspective, and there's a lot in common in terms of the way the Danes view the Faroese and the way the Danes view the Greenlanders. When Faroe had its banking crisis, and Faroe had more powers earlier than Greenland did, Denmark stepped in a sense that it wasn't actually obliged to save the Faroese economy.
Excellent. Was that what you wanted to hear, Joanna?
Yeah, I think so. I need to read. I need to read more about Svalbard and Iceland and try and get a grip on that. I was very struck by the population of Nuuk, which is twice the size of Kirkwall, and Kirkwall is huge for me. So it must feel like a metropolis, kind of out of place and just odd with those little. I saw the film about Niconat. Do you know what I'm talking about? The what's it called? Village at the End of the World. A very beautiful film about a tiny village, and I'd imagined Greenland to be like that, and I haven't really got it in my head that it was such a big conurbation. So that's all I have to say.
I did get that, I'm afraid. I heard Village at the End of the World, which sounds lovely.
It was just Joanna saying that she hadn't realised that Nuuk was so large. From her perspective, Kirkwall is large, and so it's quite a bit bigger than that. So does it seem somewhat out of place? Or, well, mind you, you've just gone there, so perhaps that's just the way it is when you get there.
So, I mean, my obvious comparison is going to be with Svalbard, of course, and Nuuk is much larger than the Norwegian town on Svalbard, which is Longyearbyen, which is 2,400 people. But, it's odd. There's a new shopping center here from a few years ago, which looks like any Western mall in miniature. It's not just a place where there are shops. They built it as a shop. There's an escalator. Who needs escalators? The way that the construction's worked here, it's quite a mountainous place. I am living in an 11-story building. On the 9th floor, this would be one of the tallest buildings in Copenhagen. The way development has happened here, it does not seem like a village. But in a sense, not that surprising, because from the Svalbard example, you don't have 11-story buildings, but in situations like this, once you start desiring a certain standard of living, it requires a certain standard of building and of infrastructure and so on. So my impression is that places like Nuuk, with populations with these expectations, end up being highly developed in these senses. I mean, the IT at the university isn't great. It's a beautiful building, though. You should look up a picture of the university at some point, because it's a good illustration of the sort of work that's going on. And I'd say that the university itself is a very interesting initiative, and including its expansion in recent years, in terms of the kind of, obviously it is beneficial to Greenland, and it must cost an absurd amount of money, including to get people like me here for 1 month. But at the same time, it could help retain these human resources who might otherwise flee to Denmark and keep living there after going to Danish universities. But it's also this kind of symbolic activity, which are so important for places like Greenland and like the Faroe Islands with their own university center. The ability to say, we are a real place. We have this university.
Yeah.
And those sorts of activities are important.
That's what's feeling like here in the Marine Centre. You
Yes.
can part of the UHI, but it's tertiary education available in Shetland, which is it's incredibly important. I think it does a lot for people's self-regard. Yeah. It does, just before I pass on to you, any other questions? Does the University of Nuuk, does it function a bit like the UHI, or can you attend it virtually from other places?
No. And in fact, I have one student who's on the other side of Greenland who's just studying by email. There is no virtual attendance, which is intriguing. I don't know if you recall Gordon Cook from Memorial University. We had him over on Skype here on Friday. He was talking about it's one of the great things which he got from his visit to Shetland back in 2012 was the way that you all are functioning and being able to draw peripheral communities together in this higher education sense. It's something quite special which is going on.
Well, we're happy to come over to Greenland and help in discussions about setting up something similar.
Hi, Adam. Hi.
Now then, Joanna's stuck. There we go. Yes, Liz, I can see you. You're all green, but fire away.
It's Liz.
Yes, Liz.
Hi. In the 1st of January, there was an article on BBC Magazine about the mining in Greeceland and whether it would save or ruin Greenland. And just interested, because of climate change, obviously more of the land is being exposed. And isn't there a danger that eventually, depending on your point of view, you will become overexploited or developed, or according to your point of view? That's my first question. And the second one's about military bases on Greenland. I gather the US have got one. Do you get paid? Does Greenland get paid for that? You go to Denmark. Do you know?
Right, I think there are two questions there. One was about the natural resources. There was a thing in Britain just earlier in the year. It was on the radio, and I think it might have been on the telly as well. There was a report from Greenland about all the mineral resources that are being exploited at the moment, or at least the debates about the exploitation of said resources because of climate change. And the programme dealt with the debates. It asked both sides of the question, and it was rather quite sensitively done, I thought. What do you think the prevailing feeling at the moment is about resources and about how to, well, whether they should be exploited or whether they should be left alone?
Well, my impression is that people on both sides of the political divide here in terms of independence or no independence are in favor of exploitation of the resources. There is a disagreement about uranium and whether or not that should be mined. Now, in terms of me personally, this is an issue that I feel strongly about in many ways. A little proviso here. I believe that climate change is the greatest threat that we're facing right now. So I'm no climate change denier. But at the same time, we have this tendency for people in large places and big polluting countries to try to place responsibility for climate change on the shoulders of those who are least able to bear this sort of responsibility. Not in terms of anyone saying that's Greenland's fault, but it's very easy, again, when you could say where a place begins and ends. It's much easier to count your carbon footprint in a small place like Greenland, which has, in terms of its consumption of resources locally, obviously, a lot of resources are consumed, but it's a drop in the bucket as far as world pollution is concerned. But, in this sense, I think it's not Greenland's responsibility to save the world. It's when this is one of the few economic activities which Greenland could conceivably undertake. Sure, I'd be delighted if other countries made the decision to ruin Greenland's economy by not making use of these natural resources. I think that would be brilliant for the world, and I'm sure we'd figure out something to do with Greenland. But in the meantime, this idea that Greenlanders should somehow, bite the bullet and say, we'll be martyrs for the sake of world climate, when places like the UK are doing virtually nothing. It's the kind of debate which is easy for politicians in places like the UK and Germany and America and China to have, because it doesn't cost them anything. Small places like Greenland have to take advantage of what advantages they could get. Is my little controversial opinion in this case, and this is also actually why I'm somewhat sympathetic to small island tax havens. In some sense, it's the responsibility of the larger places which create the problems, such as people running away to try to avoid taxes, to deal with the issues, not the places which are struggling to find any way of making money. But there was a second question as well.
Yeah, we were just
That's controversial.
just absorbing that one. It was some interesting and challenging points, but I don't think I would disagree with them. The other question.
Yes. I'm just going to say I agree entirely with that. I also think that it would be wonderful, but unrealistic, if Greenland could actually control the trade. However, the Inuit have been stopped from mining wells, much more restricted now, because there are bigger interests involved now. So, it'd be wonderful if Greenland could take control of this and make sure the right people were rewarded in the right way. Easy to say.
Yeah, I didn't get all of that, but Liz was certainly agreeing with you there. I suppose what we could also bring into the debate is furs and whaling and all these sort of things as well, because these are what small communities have lived on in the past and suffered terribly when bigger countries have decided, for whatever reason, that it's no longer kosher to do these things. And it's the small communities that...
Whale actually isn't kosher, by the way.
I guess not. The second question. Now, what was the second question? I've forgotten. But...
It was about military bases.
Oh, yeah, military bases.
I gather there's a US military base.
Yeah.
I just wondered, does Greenland actually benefit from that in any way? Because it's obviously very strategic.
The reason this ties into a little question we had just before you came on, Adam, we were talking about Keflavik in Iceland and about it had its positive and negative effects, and it split the community in Iceland down the middle about whether they actually liked having it there or not. Then, of course, everybody missed it when it went. So I just wonder, having been to see this Arctic centre, does Greenland benefit from Denmark spending money on the military?
Well, I mean, in some sense, I suspect that, there's the obvious sense that as long as these bases are within existing communities, which is the case for the Arctic Command, here in Nuuk, you get employees here spending money. It might be different in the cases of some far away, distant Danish and the American military base, in which you have more of a closed economy, in which then we could be asking, is it like gas workers in Lerwick, who, how much is actually being contributed to the local economy? I suspect that as long as people are within existing communities, that you get direct economic benefit of people spending money and jobs being created by people spending money. Another issue could be infrastructural improvements. I suspect that the amount of technology needed to run these sorts of facilities has some kind of effect on what's happening in Nuuk, for example. Those kinds of satellite facilities which are necessary for the Arctic Command Center presumably are also benefiting the local community. Obviously, it's there are ethical issues which one could have as well. Ethics are more complicated in a lot of ways, and we have no way of deciding on them. That's why sometimes it's easier to talk about the non-ethical issues that we might not be able to quantify, but that at least we could say money good, no money bad. I haven't heard, by the way, I suspect that some of the people with very anti-Danish mindsets here are probably against the Danish military. I don't think that I haven't heard any idea about against the Danish military because it's the Danish military, as opposed to the idea possibly because it's Danish. I don't get the feeling that there's a very strong anti-military presence opinion here.
That's interesting. I see Nick on the screen. Oh, Joanna's come back on. Nick was on a second ago. Do you have a question, Nick?
been away, on it.
Oh. There's Lynn. Hello, Lynn. Have you got a question?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I've got a question. We've been looking at how, in order to thrive, the resource of people is very important, that they are happy and supported. And yet I read that up to 1 in 5 people in Greenland have contemplated killing themselves, which is just shocking. How does that fit with everything into equal greater autonomy?
I think you're going to have to. I vaguely got some idea of what you're saying there, Lynn. But I think you have to repeat that.
Right. Okay. We have been looking at how confident, happy, vibrant communities are needed. They're very important to go forward. And 5 people suicide. So there's always work to be done there. Is anybody doing that in any?
Could you send me that in an email? And we'll get another question. I think it's a very interesting question. It was about being confident and successful, but how does that chime with the actual situation?
I think Lynn's microphone is set up to squelch every time that it's a technical term. If you say your question in simple words, leaving a little gap, we'll hear it.
People often have to dumb things down for me, by the way. I'm not offended.
Right, third time lucky, Jim. All right, just send me a quick email, because just a very quick email, and I'll get it here. And while I'm waiting for the email, I'm sure Nick has a question. Or maybe Nick doesn't have a question.
Can I ask one?
Yes, you may.
I sailed to Tasselak a few years ago, and it seemed there was a very strong sort of social tension between the Danish population, who were 10% of the people but 90% of the administrators, and the Greenlandic population, largely related to the problem of alcoholism that you talked about earlier. And there was a real looking down on local people by those who thought they were more educated. Do you see this in Nuuk?
Sorry, I did get all that. Andrew.
Yeah, well, that was Ian sailed to Tasselak and noticed a social tension there between the native Greenlanders and the Danes who were settled there. And the Danes were about 10% of the population, but 90% of the administration, if you like, and the good jobs. And they tended to look down on the local autochthonous Greenlanders. From what you've said, do you notice that in Nuuk as well, or is it slightly different in Nuuk because there are so many more actual Greenlanders there?
You know, I think it's going to be a combination of yes and no. In part, there really are genuine demographic differences here, with a very much larger number or percentage of Danes living here. In terms of the government itself, I mean, it is largely Greenlandic now. Civil servants and so on. I have experienced people looking down on Danes, but Danes looking down on Greenlanders. Partially, I think one of the big differences might be that the level of Danishness of the Greenlanders here, and a very large number of people of mixed race. It could be very difficult for me to distinguish someone who is half Greenlandic, half Danish, and a Dane. I can't always tell the difference, and it's such a Danicized Greenlandic community here that I think we have there's probably different sorts of dynamics. In that very many of the Greenlandic people here are going to be very culturally Danish in town. There's also a very big political divide between town and other parts of Greenland, which makes things complicated, obviously. But more than looking down on Greenlanders in general, maybe what I've experienced more of is a sense of this feeling of otherness by some of the Danes, especially in the military environment, of feeling of acting differently around Greenlanders and with Greenlanders than they would ever think of doing in Denmark. Not necessarily in an offensive way, but simply that there are different societal expectations for certain sorts of Danes living in Greenland. It gets to be a sort of a tricky area and maybe a sensitive one to discuss as well.
It would be very, very interesting as you experience more of it.
Adam, I've got a question about population demographics.
A question about population demographics.
Yeah, sort of the age ranges and the gender ratio.
Age ranges and gender ratio.
Oh, good Lord. Well,
Talk about your
well,
statistics,
Nuuk is going to be considerably younger than the other places in Greenland. As I say, there's movement from the settlements to the towns and from the towns to Nuuk. And of course, it's not the older people who are moving; it's the younger people. In terms of gender, I suspect that there used to be a much higher gender imbalance than there is today. I don't have the statistics, but when you think of in Svalbard, even now, for example, there are considerably more men than women because you have these number of people moving up there for the sort of work and the sort of experience which more men than women want to have. That's still probably the case in terms of Danes who come to work here, but because it is a minority of the population, a raised number of Danish males in Nuuk, for example, is not having a massive effect on the population in general. One issue that I've become aware of, and which I think is kind of interesting, and this is historically conditioned, is that it's far more likely to have Danish men married to Greenlandic women than the other way around. And I think the explanation here might be Danish men coming to work in Greenland in the past and even today and meeting Greenlandic women, whereas on the opposite side you have Greenlandic men and women moving to Denmark for studying maybe. And if you meet a Dane, then you stay in Denmark. But since it's primarily Danish men coming here, you're much more likely to find among the mixed race people that their father is Danish. Is much more likely than the other way around, which I suspect has some quite interesting cultural results. But I'm not here long enough and not doing the right sort of work to really be able to figure those things out.
Yeah, very interesting. Again, I'll just check, see if we got the email. Hold on a second. There we go. Yes, indeed. Now we've got, excellent. So, well, first of all, Lynn says, Master, we've discussed earlier on this course that happy, confident, vibrant people is needed to help an island thrive and go forwards. But she's read that in Greenland, 1 in 5 of the people have considered killing themselves. These are shocking figures. What, if anything, is being done to address this? Well, there you go. There's a interesting question.
Well, I mean, I'll start by saying that although I suspect that there are higher levels of certain sorts of depression in some place. It's very difficult to do these sorts of comparative analyses because information is being collected in different ways. I mean, this has been coming up in a Danish context recently in terms of antidepressant use. Danish doctors prescribe far more antidepressants than in most parts of the world, which leads to the impression that Denmark might have higher levels of depression. Here we're talking about people considering killing themselves. I mean, this is an actual issue that I know nothing about. From my experience here, I'm not seeing a place that's in a crisis of depression. I mean, there's a very real alcohol abuse problem and drug abuse problem, which of course isn't unique to Greenland, but maybe becomes more visible in places like Greenland as well. And there are these initiatives to obviously decrease alcohol abuse. I could say the alcohol here, for example, is extremely expensive. Maybe the beer at the shop isn't any more expensive than it might be in Norway, but all hard alcohol is in the maybe at the very cheapest in the 55-pound range for a bottle of hard alcohol. And when you get up to the more luxurious brands, obviously you're getting up to very, very high prices. So they're obviously doing various taxation initiatives here. The shops in town have agreed, this is not government policy, but no alcohol is being sold Saturday afternoon or any of Sunday here as well. But no, I mean, I would not say that I get the impression of this being a place in a sort of existential crisis. I think that people are concerned about the future and have strong political opinions, but from my ignorant perspective, with no in-depth knowledge of the situation here in Greenland or of this area at all, even. It's not something which I notice. Something else which I'll bring up. I've heard a lot of people criticizing the government here. Research shows, and this is a lovely point to remember sometimes, research shows across various countries, people are unhappy with their government in general. When I'm in a small island community doing interviews and people say, well, it might be nice to have more power in some ways, but have you seen what a mess of it our politicians are making? But they say that everywhere. Virtually no one likes what their government does. So that's a positive thing for politicians to remember sometimes, and for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about what people tell us about the way small island governance works. I've never been to a place, and I've been in quite a few successful small island communities as far as government is concerned. I've never been in a place where people have been happy about the actions of their government. So we have a level of political depression, which is universal. There is one thing, at least, which binds us together as a species.
Excellent. No, that was a good point.
I'm going to try again. I've been trying to
hello there.
I've done a complete reboot, and hopefully you can hear. I've been getting cut off every time I open my mic, so that's what you've heard from me. I was wondering about environmental matters. Obviously, environmental change will be having an effect in Greenland. It'll open up the opportunities for oil and mineral extraction, but I guess it's also damaging a lot of historical cultural practices. When we think in terms of Greenland becoming independence, is that purely a financial matter? If so, is environmental change likely to speed that? I suspect it might.
That was. I forgot most of that. Okay. The environment. environmental change, it's happening swiftly in Greenland, and it's opening up all these opportunities for mineral extraction. It's also probably damaging cultural, historical sites and traditional ways of life. But it's all going in the same direction as more stuff is becoming available. It's fueling this debate for independence. Do you think as the environment changes and the climate changes even more rapidly that independence is inevitable? That it will be, it's a kind of the environment is driving it.
I mean, to some extent, it's undeniable that the environment is driving this in the sense of new resources are becoming available. Although, to be perfectly clear, no one's made any money off of these mines so far. Anyway, things are in planning stages. No oil has actually been found. There's a lot of thought about what's going to happen. We'll have to see if any of those environmental or if any of these sorts of economic activities actually do happen. Right now, it is pretty much talk. Something which you brought up here, which I think could be interesting to touch upon, is the idea of the traditional ways of life changing, and that's definitely true. Where we could see, it's becoming harder and harder to undertake some of these sorts of traditional activities that would be done in the settlements. At the same time, you have different expectations for the younger generations as to what their lives should be like, and there aren't necessarily large numbers of young people who would necessarily like to get into being professional seal hunters. Something which has interested me is that I do get the impression here that when you ask people, Greenlanders, to, a typical point in my research when I do interviews with people and so on is asking folks, what is it that makes your community unique or special? And generally speaking, proud, confident communities are first going to list cultural attributes and then possibly nature later. Regardless of how pretty your nature is, if you feel strongly that there's something special about who you are as a people, you'll be saying that it's what your culture is that makes you special. And for example, that's the kind of response that you'll hear in Shetland and Orkney and so on. I'm sure many other lovely places. But what I've been hearing here is that people usually mention nature first, which is sort of a warning sign for me from my experience researching various places, that when you mention nature as what makes your place special, then it stops becoming something over which you could justifiably have some kind of pride over. And then it's something in which you as people are unable to really have this influence over. And of course, nature is unique everywhere in some sense, but the nature of Greenland isn't that different than the nature of many other places. I have found that when you ask people about what Greenlandic culture is, people will tend to have bought into this sort of international stereotype of people, even from the south of Greenland, will often be thinking of maybe the northern Greenland whaling and seal hunting societies, which is quite interesting for me, that it's an old, dying way of life that people didn't necessarily want to live themselves, which is being held up as what true Greenlandic culture is. And that's a bit worrisome in the sense of so far there's been a failure to define what kind of cosmopolitan culture Greenland might have, and here we could say that there's some kind of difference from my Shetland experience. In terms of people will talk about elements of Shetland lifestyle which you don't do when you live in Lerwick, but at the same time Lerwick isn't cut off. Lerwick isn't said to be un-Shetlandic in the same way that Nuuk is said to be not really part of true Greenlandic life. I've had Greenlanders tell me that, well, Nuuk isn't really Greenlandic. I mean, it's more Danish, despite the vast majority of people living here being Greenlanders. So it's a kind of worrisome development in terms of what the future holds about future issues. A lot of people view independence as inevitable. Even people who are against independence But we could also say the younger people tend to be in favor of keeping the relationship with Denmark, which is actually quite interesting. There'll be different sorts of dynamics you can get in some other places. If younger people tend to be in favor of keeping relationship with Denmark, then in fact time might be on the side of the Kingdom of Denmark and Faroe and Greenland, rather than on the side of independence. If it will take 20 years to develop these resources for Greenland to get economic independence, then maybe independence won't happen at all.
Interesting point. Well, that's when they opened the voting in Scotland, lowered the voting age to 16 to allow people to vote in the referendum. The assumption was that the people of 16 to 17 would be supporters of independence. Well, it turns out that they weren't.
They're not. Oops.
Oops, indeed. That's been fantastic, Adam. I've just got one last question. We were going to discuss, if we weren't able to get you today, we're going to discuss something about para-diplomacy and how islands can circumvent their states to talk to each other and do their own thing. I was just wondering, is Denmark taking an interest? Is Greenland taking an interest in the other Inuit sub-nation, or what you would call it, the territory of Nunavut? Is there much development going on there?
Well, I mean, some people have brought this issue up to me. There are some small cultural exchanges going on, but it has not been major activity as far as I can tell. But they are aware of these possibilities for the intercultural exchange. There's sort of this dynamic in that places which are undertaking para-diplomacy will tend to want to be para-diplomatic upwards, in the sense of that's how you get the benefit of being of undertaking para-diplomacy, and then you get to act like a place which is more important than you are. In this sense, one could argue that Nunavik has reasons for wanting to undertake para-diplomacy with Greenland more so than Greenland does in the other direction, would be my geopolitical analysis here.
And Greenland has got representation on the Nordic Council, and does it have representation anywhere else? Does it have its own sort of fleet of ambassador types?
Well, I mean, in Denmark there is the Greenlandic House in Aarhus, which is a cultural center, and then in the Nordlandsbrygge, in the North Atlantic House, I suppose we could call it, in Copenhagen, there is a pseudo-embassy alongside the Faroese embassy and the actual Icelandic embassy. But that, as far as I'm aware, is about it. On the Arctic Council, of course, Greenland is represented by Denmark, even. But, running actual embassy-like places, it takes a lot of resource. Not only does it cost a lot of money, but also costs skilled people who are no longer living in Greenland if you send them out elsewhere to do things. So the extent to I'm a big fan of para-diplomacy. Although when it's para-diplomacy, you're not able to call it para-diplomacy, which makes it kind of difficult to talk about it. But I actually think formal embassy-type places usually aren't particularly useful, and might actually scare some people off. Be interested in doing work with you, but once you start really pretending to be a country, then they get worried.
Well, thank you very much. I'll just turn around the camera. That's been extremely interesting and very relevant, and great to hear it coming straight from Greenland. Well, incidentally, what's the weather like in Nuuk?
Yeah, this isn't an absurdly cold place. It's actually quite light, even when I first came here, as well. It's not so incredibly far north. I'd say it's usually between -3 and -10 degrees Celsius.
Quite pleasant then.
Yes, well, it's better than rain in Copenhagen, which one would be happy otherwise. But I hope to see some of you up in Unst, possibly, who knows, next month.
Yes, well, that's a good point to bring that up. Lynn in Ireland was very interested in hearing a bit more about the conference.
Yeah, well, This is actually a combination of two conferences. One of them is Folk Belief and Traditions of the Supernatural, which will be based primarily on sort of field visits to various sites in the North Isles of Shetland. And then it'll be combining after those days of visits with a conference on the supernatural in literature and film, which together will have maybe around 45, possibly even more, presentations, which we'll be holding up at the North Unts Public Hall. Academic presentations over the course of 2 days. Should be quite exciting, and anyone's able to attend. All they have to do is pay for lunch. We actually have people from literally all over the world there. Thailand, Saudi Arabia, India, as well as the more usual suspects, such as Scotland, England, and America and Canada. But yeah, very exciting. Also, even Japan. So we should be getting all sorts of interesting discussions going on.
That sounds really good indeed. So, well, there you go, folks. Put that in your diaries. And, we'll just thank Adam very much. I know
Thank
that some
you.
people...
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Adam.
Well, thanks for being
Thank
such
you,
a nice group of people as well.
Well, they certainly are. And,
Thank you very much.
I hope you get a chance to meet them.
And Andrew claims you're actually there, but I'll believe him when I see it.
So, anyway, that was splendid. So thank you very much. And I will see you in Unst.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers now. Well, there we go, folks. That was a very interesting talk, and luckily the technology worked to a certain extent anyway. So, and with me as an interpreter, I think all your questions were asked. At least I hope they were. I think there were a few more emails came in there, but well, we can.
No problem.
We can contact him anytime you like and find out a little bit more, because he's not just an expert on Greenland, but on island studies in general and all sorts of different topics. So I'm sure they'd be more than delighted to connect with you and answer your questions and create, start conversations and dialogues going. So there we go. I think we'll just draw it to an end there. Read stuff again for next week. We'll maybe have a little bit, go back and have a little discussion of paradiplomacy that we would have done today, but we'll also take forward next week's topic. Let's have a look. There we go. Seminar 5 next week, which is autonomy and economy. So have some thoughts about that. There we go. It's got a lot of papers there. Yes. Well, maybe we'll divide them up again as we did last time. There should be at least there's probably 2 papers each, I would think there. So we need to set up a system again for who's going to read what. But we'll look at that. And then the week after that, which is the 3rd, we will have Tavish Scott in here talking about why he thinks Shetland should be an autonomous place and perhaps remain part of the UK instead of becoming part of an independent Scotland. So there we are. So have a nice week, and we'll see you on Monday. And if any interesting island stories break, then please let me know, and we'll share them around. So there we go. So thanks very much, folks. See you next week.
Andrew. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Very interesting.
Good.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Shall we have the usual system for papers?